And yeah, so this is going to be an introduction to K-debate. Basically, we're going to go over the different parts of a critique, how they function on the affirmative and the negative, and then how to respond to them, just sort of going over the basics. All right, so first, what is a critique? So a critique is basically looking at the assumptions behind your arguments, slash the resolution or debate can really be any one of them depending on the context, that lead to harms that can be avoided by using a different approach that is better than what the other side is doing or debate is currently doing. And critiques originated in policy debate. So they started in policy in, I think, about the 1990s. And I think they were invented. I read somewhere that they were invented by like Shane Stafford, but I don't know if that's true. And then they sort of spread into high school policy debate, and then from there, Lincoln Douglas debate, and then now they're starting to spread into PF. And so it's definitely good to at least know the basics. Um, so critiques are arguably just a disadvantage and a counterplan plus framework. We can get into this like more when we talk about the more specific parts. But what's important to remember is that critiques are like just arguments. So while they might seem scary and there's a lot of jargon, at the end of the day, they're just arguments in debate and they should be answered as such. So there's, yes, some more like specialized terminology and nuance in the responses, but at the end of the day, they are just making arguments that say that what you said was bad and what they want to do is better, which is the foundation for basically every argument in debate. So you can, yeah, just answer them pretty logically. All right, so starting on the negative side, so this is when the negative would be the one reading the critique against the affirmative. So first is the theory of power. Second is the link. Third is the impact. Fourth is the alternative. And then fifth is the role of the ballot or the framing. I don't really have any like fun like acronym to keep track of this. If you exclude the theory of power, you can think of it like liar for link, impact, alternative, role of the ballot, if that's an easy way for you to remember it. So on the theory of power, so this is basically the thesis of the critique. So this is more of the big picture view of things. So it's how you say when you're reading the critique that the world is structured. So it's the sort of worldview of the critique that you're reading. And an example of this would be a critique of capitalism, which would describe how power is asserted through economic control of the world. So this would be what you would be reading as your theory of power for a capitalism critique. So it's not really diving into more specific impacts like the environment. It's more so the big picture view of how the world is structured through capital accumulation. And there's also other examples. Every critique should ideally have sort of a theory of power. So, for example, on the settler colonialism critique, you could say that, the United States was founded on genocide and that settler colonialism is an ongoing process that happens every day in which, native people are subjected or indigenous people are subjected to genocide. So next for the link. So the link is basically what the other side has done that supports the power structure which you're critiquing. So the link to a critique is similar to the link to any other argument. Like it's similar to a link to like a disadvantage, and that it's just what the other side did that supports the power structure that you're critiquing. And yeah, again, it's sort of just similar to how you would link it to a disadvantage or any other argument. The nature of the kind of links might be a little bit different, but it's definitely the same idea. And what's important is in public forum, this can be a link to your opponents or the resolution. So in a format like policy debate, where everybody reads just plans and the affirmative gets to choose what they want to defend, then you can't exactly just link it to the resolution. You have to link it to specifically the plan or your opponent's arguments. But in PF, because the resolution is supposed to be the sort of stasis point for debate, you could just link it to the resolution. Just this is why you could read a critique in the first constructive speech, for example. You could just say that the resolution, for example, is supporting capitalism or supporting, I don't know, settler colonialism or whatever it is that you're critiquing. Or you could read a link to your opponents. And ideally, you're reading both. So that way you just have more offense because just like you would want to read multiple links in a normal contention, it's also advantageous for you to read multiple links into your critique. So you have multiple different ones that you can go for if some of them get refuted. And so these links, when you're reading links to your opponent, you would read them in second constructive if you're speaking second in response to the 1AC, or you would read them in first rebuttal if you're speaking first, because in your first constructive, you would have had to link it to the resolution because your opponents hadn't said anything yet. So just a little bit more into the link. Links into critique should not be links of omission. So some judges will vote on links of omission if they're like very tabula rasa. But generally, most judges do not like this kind of argument because what a link of omission basically is it's saying you didn't talk about this thing, which is the link. So, for example, a link of omission would be saying that um, if you were reading I don't know, if you were reading like an anthropocentrism critique, you would say that you didn't talk about the environment in your constructive speech. So that's a link into the critique. So that's ideally not the way that you should be reading your links, because at the point where not talking about something becomes a link into the K, then you could just read any K you want, because a constructive speech cannot talk about every single thing or every single oppressed group, which is why the links need to be specific to the resolution or your opponents. Yeah, so again, that's what a link of omission is. You didn't talk about something. And yeah, again, teams usually read multiple different links, and you should, so you can collapse onto one of them in the back half. An example of just a pretty standard link into an argument would be, for example, supporting state action is colonialist because the United States was founded on native genocide. So any sort of support for the state, which is presumably what the affirmative is doing because most resolutions prescribe policy actions, the critique would say that any sort of policy action that you're supporting is supporting the state, which is inherently problematic because it was founded on the genocide of indigenous people. Okay, so now we get to the impact of the critique. So this is the impacts of the structure that your sort of critique is talking about. So the theory of power that we talked about earlier was more so talking about the larger structural claim about how the world works under your power structure. The impact is the more tangible things that are caused by that power structure and what you're critiquing. So this can be post-fiat. So just if anybody's not familiar with what post-fiat means, it means sort of in the world of the resolution, after the resolution gets passed, like assuming that the thing that the affirmative is proposing actually happens in like this debate, like fairy tale world, I guess. You're sort of just imagining a world in which the resolution has happened. So an example of something post-fiat you could say as an impact is that capitalism causes environmental exploitation and endless wars. And the warrant behind this would be something like that companies, and specifically companies that are using a lot of fossil fuels, like big oil companies, are always going to have a profit incentive to keep drilling and burning more and more fossil fuels under the capitalist system, which is going to lead to climate change and is arguably what has already caused a lot of climate change. And then you could also say endless wars because, of course, when we're going to war, the people who are profiting are the ones that are making the weapons, which is why when we go into these massive wars, the arms industry actually makes a ton of money through a sort of capitalist incentive. So that would be a post-fiat impact of a critique in saying that capitalism causes all of these terrible things to occur. And they can also be pre-fiat. So pre-fiat means sort of before the resolution gets passed. So it's oftentimes critiquing, saying it, happens before the resolution. So it can be critiquing your opponent's behavior or talking about typically claiming some sort of change in the real world. So an example of a pre-fiat impact off of a critique could be that support for racist structures makes debate unsafe for minority debaters. And so this is a sort of claim that's becoming more and more common in public forum in saying that the links are microaggressions, which makes debate unsafe. So if you were reading an Afro-pessimism critique, for example, and let's say you win your link, let's say maybe one of the links into Afro-pessimism was talking about extinction and talking about sacrificing it all to prevent extinction, and in that sacrificing black bodies and not trying to ignoring the struggles of black people. If that was your link, then you could say that in the affirmative, talking about extinction, that has made the round unsafe for minority debaters and was essentially a microaggression, which makes the debate unsafe. And these can also be read, for example, something that a lot of people were reading on the surveillance topic at the very beginning of the year was the illegal immigrants critique, or sort of more of a word pick, which is when people would use the term illegal aliens or illegal immigrants to describe undocumented people coming across the border. You could say that that's a pre-fiat impact and that it makes debate unsafe for, debaters who are immigrants or, have family members or even just know people who are. And then impacts are often both. So it's, of course, very strategic to be able to compete on both the post-fiat and pre-fiat level. So you can choose to go for either one in the back half when you should be collapsing. All right, so next is the alternative. So the alternative is what we should be doing to resolve the impacts of the critique. So when we said earlier that a critique could basically be described as a disadvantage, a counterplan, and framework, the alternative is basically the counterplan, and that the link and the impact is the disadvantage, and the alternative is the sort of counterplan. And of course, it's not completely analogous, but that could be sort of a good way to think about it. So it's what you're proposing that we do instead to resolve the impacts that you talk about, or more so resolve the links that the affirmative has done. So alternatives are kind of sketchy in PF. So in policy debate and Lincoln Douglas debate, alternatives can sort of fly more because in those events, people read counterplans all the time. Like counterplans are the norm in circuit debate. And there might be some sort of theory shells, but for the most part, people do not deny the fact that the negative should get to read counterplans against the affirmative. But in PF, you can't read counterplans because the rules explicitly say, neither side may offer a plan or counterplan. So to get around this, there's a couple ways. One of them is to say it's a generalized practical solution. And the rules do explicitly allow for it. So the NSDA rulebook says something along the lines of neither side may offer a plan or counterplan, but they can both propose generalized practical solutions. So you could say that your alternative is a generalized and practical solution to resolving the things that you talk about in your critique. But either way, the alternative is always going to be sort of sketchy, and it's almost always going to be the weakest part of the critique. And so an example of the alternative could be that to resolve settler colonialism, we need to embrace decolonization. So just you could make it just say that materially we should give the land back to indigenous people who it was stolen from. Or another example is on the capitalism critique. Common one is to endorse Communist Party movement building and dual power organizing, which says that essentially we should endorse the Communist Party and a grassroots movement in order to overthrow the larger structures of capitalism. All right, so finally is the role of the ballot and the framing. So this is how the judge should view the round and debate. So your critique so far has made claims in the theory of power about how the world is structured. The length, what the affirmative did to sort of support that negative thing that's happening. The impact, how that plays out. The alternative, how we should resolve that. But then The role of the ballot and the framing is how the judge should view the round. It should view the purpose of debate. And so this is sort of why it's good to talk about your argument. So why should the judge care that you're reading a critique and you're not, reading a counterplay and engaging with typical policy debate when you're reading a disadvantage? So the framing is talking about why specifically this kind of argumentation should be prioritized and why this should be the lens through which the judge evaluates the round. It's really why your argument comes first. And so this will be, you can use this, your role of the ballot and framing to say K over theory. So, for example, if you say, I don't know, something like the role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best provides a method of resistance against capitalism or something like that, you could say that obviously when the other side's reading like, I don't know, disclosure theory or something, that's not doing anything against capitalism, which means that since that's the way that the judge should view the round, then the judge can't vote on theory. And also, you want to be saying K over substance and over the 1AC. You always want to be saying that the critique is a prior question to what the affirmative talks about, because this will make the debate much easier to win. And you don't, strictly speaking, need to read a roll of the ballot. Like you can just read a critique without the roll of the ballot. But the roll of the ballot is oftentimes useful to use it to say an argument that's becoming increasingly common in public forum is to go really hard on just the text of the roll of the ballot. And if the other side doesn't read their own roll of the ballot or a roll of the judge, then in front of some judges, it's basically GG's because there's only one roll of the ballot and it's yours, which means that's how the judge has to evaluate the debate. And so, in terms of the bare bones of the critique, you really only need the link, the impact, and the alternative. Like, you could read a critique that didn't have framing or that didn't have, um, I guess, your sort of theory of power. Like, the link, impact, and the alternative are the kind of core parts of what makes up a critique and that you need to be reading every round. Um, Although theoretically, you could swap out the alternative for framing and just say like you should lose if you supported genocide, if you were reading like a settler colonialism critique, and then you say, well, we don't need to win that we resolve these impacts because you should lose for propagating them in the first place. Okay, so now in terms of how to respond to the critique. So how to respond to the negative critiques. This would be when you're on the affirmative and you got up, you read your 1AC, and the negative stood up and they read a critique, how you should go about responding to that. So like FIRE acronym to remember this is F postal. So that stands for framework, permutation, offense, solvency deficit, turn, alternative, and link. I don't know what happened with the slides there. But first is framework. So what you want to be reading on the affirmative when you're reading framework is you want to say we get to weigh the F. So similarly to how the critique will say the K is a prior question, we need to examine what the affirmative has done before we can actually weigh the consequence of the affirmative. When you're on the AF, you always want to say, we get to weigh the AF. We get to leverage the 1AC against the critique, and that will make K rounds a lot more manageable for the affirmative because if you're allowed to weigh the AF, it means that you can weigh the affirmative against the critique, and you don't just need to win like defense and beat back the entire critique, which is what you would have to do otherwise. And so you need to be going for this. Like framework is your best friend, and you should, when you're on the affirmative, like the affirmative should basically be reading framework every round against the K. And this is where a lot of the core clash ends up taking place in a lot of K rounds. So where the negative will be saying, no, you don't get to weigh the plan. The critique is a prior question. And on the affirmative, you'll be saying, no, we should get to unconditionally weigh the affirmative regardless of any and all prior questions. And just like, one common warrant for why you should get to weigh the AF is you can say that it's impossible to predict all the different things that people could critique, right? Like, there's a million different links that you could find off of the affirmative, off of a singular card that you read, off of like one epistemological assumption. So it's impossible to predict, which means that it's never possible to create the perfect 1AC, which means that you should just be able to weigh it. Because if you're not, and if you can't, then you could say that the negative would just win every round because they could just win some random link to something you did and you would lose. Um, when you're on the negative, you're going for framework, a very common negative framework argument is to say sort of what we were talking about earlier on the pre-fiat impact level, and to say that like if you made debate unsafe, then that's definitely a prior question because like one, it probably outweighs on magnitude because like racism or something is like definitely worse than like violating procedural fairness. Um, but also it's a prior question that if the round's unsafe, then obviously people can't engage in the first place, which makes it a prior question. And you could also go for like epistemology, saying that, you have to weigh you have to think about the epistemological underpinnings of an argument before you can actually examine the impacts of the argument. Because if you don't, then you don't know the lens through which to view the impacts. So next up is the permutation. So the permutation is a test of competition. So it's basically saying, are the affirmative and the alternative mutually exclusive? So permutations also exist in counterplan debates, um, because similarly to the counterplan, the alternative is the negative deviating from the status quo and trying to take on an action. So crucially, though, the negative, whatever they're proposing, has to be different than the affirmative. Because if not, the negative would just win every debate. Because the negative could just stand up there and they could say, oh, we should, like, I don't know, we should just, like, all be nice to each other and create, like, infinite happiness in the world. And, like, if the negative could just say whatever they want, they would win every debate because they could just create a utopian world, which is why they need to prove that it's mutually exclusive with doing the affirmative and that the affirmative inhibits the alternative. So, some examples of the permutation. When on the affirmative, you're saying that they are not mutually exclusive, is the argument you're making with the perm. First, perm do both. This is the most common permutation argument that you should be making basically every debate. And what it says is that we can do the affirmative and we can do the alternative at the same time. So we can just do them together. We can do both. Another one is perm do the aff. So perm do the aff tests whether the affirmative alone is compatible with rejecting the critique's assumptions or avoiding its impacts without doing the alternative. So perm do the aff, I think, is probably most common when you're reading more of like a soft left aff or like something more like structural violence framing. So an example of when you could read something like permutation do the F is on the Taiwan topic, when there might be some affirmatives about decreasing military presence from Taiwan, which say could decrease reliance on the military industrial complex, which wants to give lots of arms to Taiwan. And military industrial complex is like definitely pretty capitalist and not a good thing. So the negative critique, though, might say that you're doing these small incremental reforms that never actually get at the larger structure of capitalism and just really re-entrench the mindset that what we're doing is enough, which leads to never which inhibits the ability of the alternative to ever happen. So an example of perm do the aff is to say, no, like our affirmative is good and it is anti-capitalist and it's against the military industrial complex, which means that it does reject the critique assumptions and it avoids the impacts. You don't need to do the alternative. And then another one is perm do the aff, then the alt. You say we can do the alternative in every other instance. We just need to do the aff once right now to prevent the harms laid out in the 1AC. So like maybe you talked about like an extinction level impact. You can say, we're not saying that like you can't do the alternative. We just have to sequence it. So you do the affirmative first, so we stop extinction, and then you can like overthrow capitalism. And there's like tons of different perm arguments you can read. But these are just, the most common ones and the basics. And yeah. How does perm do the AF solve the impacts of the CapK? Says Leon Lee. We'll take more questions at the end. But basically, perm do the AF doesn't like exactly, it's not so much that it resolves the impacts, like resolves all of the impacts, because that's obviously not what the affirmative does. Um, but it's more so that it um like is a rejection of capitalism and it is avoiding its impacts, and that the affirmative is sort of in line with the idea of the alternative, so that you don't need to do the alternative. Okay. Uh, Next is offense. So offense is saying their K is bad or it's wrong. So this can be a impact turn or a link turn. So you can be either link turning critique or impact turning critique. Both of them work for offense. So an example of this is just you impact turn capitalism on the cap K. You say capitalism is good because it promotes innovation and promotes us trying to solve problems. You could say that capitalism is a reason why tons of people have been lifted out of poverty. And a key one here that a lot of people go for is in terms of the environment, saying that capitalism can actually solve back for environmental damage through green technology and innovation. Another example, you could say that the state is good. So critique will say that the state is bad and they are always going to be discriminatory and harmful towards minority groups. You can say no, the state is good, and you can point to, historical examples of this, such as the Civil Rights Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act, which actually really did a lot for people, and they were actions that the state took which helped to resolve issues. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick right now. Next is the solvency deficit. So this one's pretty simple. It's just saying that the framework and the alternative cannot solve. So whatever claims they're saying in order to solve structures, it's saying that they can't do it and that it's going to fail for a number of reasons. Next is theory. So there's a lot of different theory shells that you can read against critiques because, I mean, some people just say that like critiques are cheating. And so there's a lot of like sketchy stuff that critiques kind of do, like we talked about earlier when we were going over the alternative. So theory is a great way to check back against this and sort of go after some of the things that the critique is doing that it seems like maybe they shouldn't be doing. Um, so first, just no alts. Um, and so this says that basically the negative must defend the status quo, and they can't defend some sort of alternative or something else that they create. They must defend what's given to them in the resolution. And this is in my opinion, the strongest standard for this is that the PF rules just straight up say no counterplans. So if you can win that the alternative is, adjacent to what a counterplan would be, then it should be forbidden by the rules. And, you can also say just independently of the rules that reading alternatives is unfair because the affirmative is forced to stick to the resolution, whereas the negative, in the world of reading alternatives could, just imagine whatever they wanted to, which gives them more ground than the affirmative, which would be unfair. Vague alt is another one. So it says that the alternative is too vague, which is unfair because the alternative can be infinitely shifty. So if the alternative is just something which is really vague and it's, I don't know, maybe something like I don't know, if you were to read an alternative on like the cap K, which is like to imagine anti-capitalist resistance or like something like that, which is like really vague in terms of what that actually means materially or what you're actually doing, then that's pretty unfair because the negative can just stand up in summary and be like, psych, all of your response and rebuttal didn't actually apply because that's not what the alternative is, and constantly shift it. So vague alt is a way to sort of check back against that. More theory shells. There's spec roll of the ballot. This shell is also known as the Colt pacemaker shell. But you probably shouldn't call it that because that was like a gun that was used to kill indigenous people. So just call it spec roll of the ballot, I guess. Um, so this says that the affirmative must specify a comprehensive, or I don't know why it says the F. Like the team reading the critique, I guess in this case, the negative must specify a comprehensive role of the ballot and how to weigh offense under it. And the standard of this is to say that without this role of the ballot, the AF can't engage accurately with the critique because they don't know how under your theory of power, under your, I guess more accurately, under your role of the ballot in framing, how offense ought to operate in the round. For example, if you were to just say, like the role of the ballot is to like vote for the team that best embraces feminist pedagogy. Like you don't really know what that means. Like how do you embrace feminist pedagogy? Like if you just stood up and just like talked about how much like you support women and something like that. Like, is that embracing or fitting under the role of the ballot? Like, I don't know. So, spec role of the ballot is saying you need to specify and tell us how offense should play out under your role of the ballot, or else, similarly to the vague alt shell, you can just endlessly shift out of things and say that the responses that the affirmative is going to make don't actually apply. Final one is spec fiat status. I don't think this shell is very good, but some people were reading it this year. So basically just says that the K must specify if the critique is pre-fiat or post-fiat, which ensures good clash over the critique because the affirmative knows if they're being critiqued on a pre-fiat level or a post-fiat. All right, next is the alternative and the link. This is like one slide because they're kind of smaller. So in terms of attacking the alternative, so you want to say, yeah, the alternative is bad or can't solve. So you could be reading DAs to the alternative, which would be kind of turns. You can think of it as a turn, like how you would just turn a contention saying their alternative is actually bad, or it can't solve, which would be more of a D-link. So an example of this would be that the Communist Party gets like absolutely cooked by transition wars. Like capitalists are not going to go out peacefully. They're going to freak out and they're not going to do that. It's not going to be a peaceful transition. I see some of the stuff in the chat, so I answer questions at the end. I guess another example of, an alternative, an alternative not being able to solve, for example, a way you could read a D-link is you could say that in terms of capitalism, either A, it's democratic, in which case workers would just vote back into capitalism because people usually support it, or it would be a dictatorship, in which case it would just devolve from being a workers' movement into a like totalitarian government, which is what we saw in like Soviet Russia and why that failed. And then in terms of how to respond to the link, we don't link. Pretty self-explanatory. If they say something you said was a link into the critique, you can say, no, that's not a link into the critique. Or you can say you also link. So if the negative is also linking into their own critique by something that they said or did, then then that's probably bad because at that point when they're linking into their own argument, it's difficult to go under offense off of it. So now moving on to the KAF, critical affirmative. This one's going to be a little bit shorter than K's on the neg, just because it's a little bit more simple, and I think they're also tend to be less common. So KAF says first, there's a problem with either debate or the resolution. An example of this is to say that women are excluded from the debate space. So debate is a structurally sexist space. There's lower female participation rates in general. Female debaters win at lower rates for those that do end up staying in the activity. And debate is overall, really sexist towards women, and judges will make discriminatory comments. That sort of thing could be the problem that you've identified with debate. And next, you have the method. And the method is how the affirmative proposes that we resolve the problems that have been outlined. So we outlined that women are excluded from debate, and the method is how we should go about solving those issues. And one example of this is a feminist killjoy sort of method where it says that, women should be like killjoys in order to, in the debate, in order to resolve the like problem with debate that women are structurally excluded and discriminated against. And then finally is the role of the ballot, similar to the critique on the negative. This is just why the K comes first and how the judge should view the debate. So this is, again, why it's good to stand up and talk about resolving things within a debate as opposed or resolving like things with debate structurally instead of standing up and reading something which endorses the resolutions. This is the lens through which you want the judge to view the round. and why your critique is a good thing to talk about. Um, you can also read a chaos that just completely supports the resolution in a critical way. So you can say that, yeah, we're completely topical. We support doing the resolution, but you're taking a critical lens to it. So instead of talking about, having your impact be extinction or some massive war or, I don't know, like economic collapse, you're taking a more critical approach to the topic and saying um, that the affirmative in the resolution is a way of doing that. Sorry. So in this case, the alternative is basically doing the resolution and affirming. So how to respond to the KF? First thing, topicality. Um, you should talk about the topic. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's probably the most common response to chaos, also probably the best response to chaos. That negative teams go for a ton. Basically, when the affirmative can stand up and talk about anything, they could just talk about literally anything they want. If it doesn't have to be affirming the topic, then that's obviously impossible to prep for and pretty unfair for the negative because they don't know before the round, what they should prepare for the affirmatives. The affirmative can just stand up, say anything they want, which is unfair for the negative and also means that they're not going to be able to accurately or adequately clash over what the affirmatives presented because they weren't prepared for the KF that was written. Another one is KVK. So you're reading a counter critique. So the affirmative reads a critique on the aff, and you read a K on the negative. And I think that KVK debates can actually be really great ways to engage with the critical affirmative um, instead of just topicality. Um, and so, most common one by far in KVK debates is the CapK, because it's just so good in responding to most like identity positions and chaos, because you can almost, all the time say that capitalism is a prior question, and it's what structures, almost all oppression in society. So a very common one is sort of saying the the like KVK, when you would say the cap K against Afro-pessimism or anti-blackness critiques, and to say that the reason why this like racism and violent power structures originated in the first place was because of capitalism and the desire for the capitalist class to fracture the working class between like white workers and black workers as two different groups of people. And so they both couldn't rise up together to displace the ruling class. So they had to be fractured, which is an example of how capitalism is sort of a prerequisite to racism and anti-blackness. This is actually something that happened like back in the 1600s in Virginia and is sort of the origin of like race-based chattel slavery in America. So I would encourage people to go do more research on that if you're interested. Also, the Academy K is a extremely common critique, basically saying that the affirmative is in the academy. They're in debate and they're just talking about problems, but they're not actually doing anything to resolve those problems. So they feel good about themselves, but they don't actually make any change in the real world. You can also read the anthropocentrism critique, which isn't super common, and I don't know if it's the best argument, but basically the argument with anthro in KVK debates is that the theory of power is that the like speciesism and anthropocentrism, which means like being human centric, is what created all other types of oppression and structures of hierarchy when during the agricultural revolution we made the split between the human and the non-human and made that a fundamental creation of hierarchy that allowed for patriarchy, slavery, warfare, genocide, all of those different things. And so saying that it's a prior question and you need to first deconstruct anthropocentrism, and then that allows you to go after different other power structures. And then finally, you can read disads and turns to the affirmatives method most commonly. Backlash This is a sort of more controversial one, but basically you could just say people are reading these non-topical arguments in debate. There will be backlash against them, and will actually stop the critique from making real change and will alienate certain members of the community. Arguably, this is more of a controversial argument because, you can say the same logic would have been applied to say that like we shouldn't have like ended slavery because the South was mad about it and they would have backlashed. So you can kind of get yourself into hot water when you're reading backlash. So you need to make sure you're framing it as like, saying that yes, of course these issues are important. We should discuss them outside of the round, but reading it specifically in debates creates backlash, which turns the method. Oppression Olympics is another common one, which says that um, when if the affirmative gets up there and reads something about how we should prioritize women in debate, then theoretically that just devolves down into who can gain offense off of the most marginalized group, which is bad because we don't really want to be comparing different groups' marginalization. And then finally is the competition turn. This is kind of similar to backlash, and that it said, or I guess not really. And what it says is that because debate is a game and it's competition, everybody wants to win. It means that you're going to refine your critique in order to what best resolves ballots and not what actually resolves the like violent power structures that you discuss. And just some common critiques. Capitalism, we've talked about a lot as examples in this lecture. Settler colonialism is also extremely common critique. Afro-pessimism is pretty common, especially it's had lots of success in PF at the TOC recently with Iowa City West reading it. And then the security K, which isn't actually read that much in PF, but it's one of the most common Ks or most stock Ks just in general and in policy in LD. So I think these are, the top four Ks that I think are most commonly read and discussed in PF. Some good K rounds, just a couple recommendations. I guess I'm not going to go through all of them, but here are five different K rounds on YouTube. I tried to choose ones which are like slower and slightly more understandable. Um, but no promises because I think K rounds do tend to have a lot of spreading and they do tend to be pretty fast. So this Ivy Street round robin one I would probably recommend the most. With Walt Whitman versus Brentwood HM. It's like an extremely digestible, understandable round, almost at like a lay speed. It's just a great debate to watch. Um, all right, yeah. So that's basically the end of the lecture. I know Oliver's lecture starts in like 13 minutes, so don't know if we have too much time, but we can do questions now. Um, So you can put questions in the chat. You can like message me privately or just send it to everyone. Um, why aren't there Summit rounds? Yeah, he's a great K debater. You should watch Strake SM rounds. Yeah, you should watch this. Oh yeah, I'll do the slideshow link. Um, all right. There's the link to the slideshow if anybody wants to check it out. Any of the rounds that were linked. Um, I think just going back to some of the questions earlier in the chat. Yes, spec stands for specify. So spec rule of ballot means that you have to specify a certain role of the ballot. Um, how do I warrant fairness as an impact versus an internal link? Yeah, like I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to like do fairness as an impact. I think it's kind of like some judges say it is, some judges say it isn't. I guess fairness as an impact is like, being unfair like is inherently bad because debate is a competitive activity and obviously an eternal link is much easier because, links into everything. You probably can't engage with much else if it's not, like if the debate isn't fair. Yes, I am vegan. You should be too. Um, um, Yeah, yeah. Oh, so you should never read Anthro against an identity K. Yeah, so this is something I probably should have clarified. When you're reading Anthro against identity K, you definitely don't want to say that like animals outweigh humans. Like that's definitely not a claim that you want to be making because obviously that's like kind of comes across like very problematic. Um, so you don't want to be saying that animals are more important than the marginalized group. You rather want to say that the theory of power of the anthropocentrism critique is a prior question to the affirmatives method and resolving the impacts. So you still want to agree. You could be like, sure, solving the impacts for this marginalized group comes first, but the way we best do that is by first deconstructing anthropocentrism. Um, what else? Post fiat, the impacts that happen in the future, and pre fiat, what's happening right now. Kind of. So post fiat
Oh,
is more so the impacts that
oh,
happen.
wait, yeah, yeah.
Whoever's oh, can you, like, mute, thanks. I think that post fiat arguments are what happens after the resolution passes. And so saying like assuming that the affirmative happens and we do the resolution, that's what's going to happen. So like an example of a post fiat impact is like the affirmative, I don't know, beats China in the tech race and we stop nuclear war from happening. Whereas a pre-fiat impact is happening like before the resolution. So it's like, let's say somebody used the word like illegal immigrants instead of like undocumented immigrants. You could say that that's pre-fiat and that it implicates to the debate space and should be an impact considered before we even talk about if the resolution occurs or not. So basically, pre-fiat, before the resolution, and post-fiat in the sort of imagination world that the resolution has happened. Um, I should be a K debater next year. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Stop cheating. I would never be a cheater like that. No, yeah, I don't know. Uh, isn't that an overreaching claim that the that of Anthro that the authors endorse, like the claim that animals should be prioritized over humans. I mean, not necessarily. I think that I mean, obviously it depends on the author that you're like reading. Um, but I think that first, there's some authors that don't necessarily say that like the environment should be prioritized more than or the environment and animals should be prioritized more than people, just more so that the mindset in which you view human domination over the environment is what like recreates all of the issues that people are talking about. And I also don't really think it matters too much, like the other things that the authors are saying, insofar as that's like not specifically how you're applying it in that round. So I think it's kind of like voting on a potential argument that you could have made, but it doesn't really matter because that's not an argument you actually made. Should people go for word IVIs more? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on like judge the round. I mean, I think they're like kind of like I mean, obviously it depends. I think like they can be kind of like semantical and like dumb sometimes when it's like if we're really policing and this is like one of the like ways you should respond to like word IVIs, which is like should we really be policing like this much because like it takes away from like the actual material change by focusing on like individual words. But like there's certainly instances where like it can be harmful and that like illegal immigrants are like probably not a good thing to say. Yeah. The alt might be cooked in PF if counterplans are banned, and the alt is similar to the counterplan. How do people running an alt argue against this, or how do they make a distinction between their alt and the counterplan? Yeah, this is a great question. So I think first thing is the generalized practical solution thing, like I talked about. And so in order to make a distinction, you would say a counterplan is something which is like, a specific, formal proposal. And you could say that something like decolonization isn't necessarily like a full-on, like, here's how we're going to decolonize, here's who's going to direct it, here's the timeline. It's like, it's not like that. It's just the general method of decolonization which you could say is um, which you could say, is a good generalized practical solution. I think a second thing, which is not something people say too much, but you could say, is that the NSDA rules aren't actually used at most tournament at like almost all tournaments, which means that the whole no counterplans thing like shouldn't apply because like it's not the NSDA rules. Yeah. Oh yeah, and then also what Cruz said. Like obviously you should test the rules. Um, is the Kaplan critique true? I mean, I don't know. Maybe. Um, counterplan equals for clear formal processes, and the alt is a concept or ideal to embrace with several ways to go about it. Kind of. Like yes, except for the several ways to go about it, because you don't necessarily want to be saying like, here's a bunch of things we could do. Like you want to have a sort of concrete method of what you are doing. Um, but it should be like more generalized and a little bit less specific and a little bit more of like a general idea and a solution. Um, one kind of issue with this though, which you could say is that it's kind of a double bind in that either it's going to be a vague alternative because it was way too general, which means that it's vague and it's shifty, or it's too specific, in which case it's a counterpoint. So that's, something kind of have to toe the line on alternatives. Um, for Bayesian theory in general, do you say the stuff, do you like say the alternative or you just read the alt without the alternative? Like generally when people are reading K's, you don't say like the alternative is I don't know, whatever. You can say that, especially to judges that might have like less experience, like with critiques, it might be helpful to just say this is the alternative. But usually people will just read it and you'll say like, I don't know, something like vote negative to embrace eco-psychoanalysis, or like something like that would be what you would say for the alternative. Um, if it's more generalized, aren't all alts just going to face the vague alt theory shell? Yeah, I mean, this is like, yeah, what I was saying earlier, which is difficult. Um, and that I think either you can say, like, yeah, just kind of bite the bullet on, be like, yeah, it is vague, and then just respond to vague alts. Or you can say that, um, or you can say that no, it's not a vague alternative. Like we know what we're doing. We're doing decolonization. It's just a general way of something that's not vague. Like it's concrete what we're doing, but it's still a generalized solution. Uh, what are your thoughts on role of the judge, role of the ballot as arguments that outlayer everything? Do you think that's silly? Um, yeah, I personally think that uh just saying like the role of the ballot is conceded, and so that has to uplayer everything. I don't know if that makes too much sense because it's like just because you said the words role of the ballot, like it doesn't replace just actually weighing between arguments. And if there was just an argument which uplayered the role of the ballot, it seems like that should come first. But I also know that there's a lot of people who just like think that there's reasons that the role of the ballot and the role of the judge should just filter all of the offense. So um, yeah, I don't know. But I think it's definitely an argument to be made that it is like kind of semantical, but I think that it's also something that people win a lot of friends on. For theory, for the interp, do you just read the interp? How do you transition from substance to theory in a speech? Um, so this lecture is more about like K's. I think that there might be like a later theory lecture, but in general, I guess just how to transition um to theory and like critiques for a substance, like between different offs. Generally, you just want to like say what things are. So you want to say like you just want to say like first off is the capitalism critique, then you read the critique. You'd be like next is the case. Contention one is whatever. How the role of the judge interacts with the role of the ballot. Is it strategic to make arguments that up players? I mean, I think you should make arguments about what up players, because like, why not? I think, I don't know. If you want to learn about role of the judge, role of the ballot stuff, people should definitely watch New Wave rounds because they do like a lot of that and very effectively. So yeah, watch New Wave rounds. I think like the role of the judge and role of the ballot thing is like, if you really think about it, I think one way to view it is that they're kind of inseparable in that like the judge is the one submitting the ballot. So like if the judge is doing one thing and the ballot's doing another, like it's impossible to render a decision because like they're both needed in the process of adjudicating the debate. But you can definitely say that like the judge decides how the ballot works, which means that the role of the judge comes first, or like the ballot is what is specific to that round. So even if the judge in general does one thing, specifically they need to use the ballot to do a different thing. All right, this is gonna be like the last question because I think we're basically out of time. In F postal, do we focus on every letter for the acronym or just like focus on two? Yeah, I think it's kind of dependent on uh the specific round. I think that, yeah, again, you should always read framework. Um, Generally, you probably want to be reading some sort of most of those responses. Um, but I think that it's contextual to the round. So, for example, if you just wanted to, if somebody read like the cap K on you and you just want to hard impact turn capitalism, like you can just concede the link. Be like, yeah, we link. Capitalism's like freaking awesome and just go for it. Um, so, or well, yeah, so like depending on your strategy, you could read certain ones but not others. But in general, you probably want to be, reading most of them. Um, okay, so I think we're basically gonna wrap it up there. Feel free to like, I don't know, DM me on Instagram or Discord if you have any other questions. Or want to like talk about anything debate related.